Hey guys, I'm Andy Christoph. Welcome to Pathbend, where we explore how to reconnect with ourselves, rebuild trust in our relationships, and reclaim our authentic purpose. Today is the second episode I promised in the series on the brain and nervous system. Earlier, we looked at the why and the what of integration. Now we're going to look at the how and the when. How do we actually go about doing it, and what are the timelines we can realistically expect to see some real measurable progress? In the last episode, we toured the nervous system using the metaphor of a three-story duplex. We mapped the structures of the nervous system and showed how different mechanisms control different processes, work at different speeds, and communicate in different codes. Today we're going to build heavily on those insights, so if you haven't seen that video, I'm going to link it in the description below. You may want to check it out first to wrap your head around everything I'm saying. Let me briefly recap. The basement houses the survival brain, the autonomic nervous system, which is run by structures critical for staying alive. The brainstem, the vagus nerve, and the HPA axis. We compared these to the electrical and heating systems that keep the building running. Up one level on the ground floor is the limbic system, the emotional brain. It's the interface between your inner world and everything outside it, between the building and the street. It includes the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the thalamus, and it's where implicit memories, context, and threat detection are located. The top floor is the neocortex, the executive quarters where you think, plan, tell your life story, and talk to your therapist about your experience. The central insight of that video was simple. Location matters. And often the issue doesn't live where you're doing the renovation. Most of us spend our time upstairs. Most of our tools, therapy, journaling, self-help, operate on the top floor. Yet the roots of our suffering often run 2 floors down. And now that we have a map of the entire building, we can ask the sharper, more practical set of questions. If repair needs to happen throughout the building, what shifts easily, what resists, and what requires sustained effort? I'll introduce what I call the Malleability Hierarchy. It's a way of understanding how responsive different systems are to change effort and what intervention tools belong where. Because here's something you rarely hear. Different structures have profoundly different responsiveness to change. Some can reorganize in weeks, others are going to take several months to several years, and some, once they're installed and calibrated, essentially don't budge. They're like foundational infrastructure. You don't tear down the building to reinstall it from scratch. Today we start on the top floor, the living quarters and executive offices, because this is the most responsive part of the building. It changes most quickly, and the tools we have to work with it are the most developed. The prefrontal cortex remains highly plastic throughout life. This is where we can do powerful interventions like cognitive reframing, impulse regulation, perspective taking, and narrative reconstruction. When you're working with a coach or a therapist, when you're journaling, when you learn to notice and challenge a distorted thought before you start spiraling, you're literally rewiring neural circuitry. And these prefrontal regions respond quite reliably to structured approaches. The most well-supported tools here are CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the gold standard for identifying and restructuring maladaptive thought patterns, psychodynamic therapy for deepening reflective capacity, and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy to build non-reactive awareness of your mental content. I'll link a more comprehensive breakdown in the description below, so don't worry about memorizing any of this. The important thing here is that the timeline is really inspiring. We're talking about months or even weeks to start noticing measurable change. What changes is your ability to intervene consciously. You can now start noticing reactions as they form and insert a pause. And in that pause, you can compare the competing interpretations and make decisions under moderate stress without immediately defaulting to survival logic. This is exactly why insight feels so powerful, because at this level, it totally is. But there's one wrinkle here. its effectiveness depends on the prefrontal cortex remaining online. But when your nervous system shifts into defense, whether it's because of an actual threat in your environment or just a learned prediction of one, the entire prefrontal cortex region loses priority. Blood flow and metabolic resources go straight to survival systems. No amount of cognitive skill can compensate for that. The second highly malleable system sits just beneath this one. These are the so-called attention and precision weighting circuits. They're coordinated by prefrontal networks, and they also involve limbic structures and neuromodulators, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin. What they do is essentially they determine what signals your brain treats as important and which get ignored. They shape what you pay attention to from one moment to the next, and how your brain treats ambiguous cues. Are they coded as information or are they flagged as danger? And the great thing here is that these systems are highly trainable. The most effective interventions are mindfulness meditation, especially sustained attention and open monitoring, exposure-based therapies where we update the prediction models through repeated safe contact, and then secure relational experiences where prolonged contact with other people who are regulated gradually tip the system's balance toward prioritizing non-threatening cues. What changes here is the weights your brain assigns to signals. Those ambiguous cues that used to signal danger are no longer getting automatically tagged as threats. Neutral information regains neutrality, and your cognitive bandwidth expands. This is important because attention shapes learning. When you recalibrate precision weighting, you stop reinforcing the very unwanted patterns you're trying to undo. That's meaningful structural change. Having said that, this set of circuits is exposed to the same risk as the prefrontal cortex. When the alarm goes off on the lower floors and you go into fight, flight, or freeze activation, this system goes offline too. So how do we deal with these pesky alarms below? As we take the flight of stairs down to the ground floor, the pace of change slows substantially. As a rule, we're now talking about systems that take sustained embodied work over months to years. And this is where the gap between intellectual understanding and lived experience becomes really visible. Now, the first stop we need to make here is the insula, that translation hub between body and conscious mind. It does respond to training, but more slowly. And it takes a particular kind of work: somatic therapy, breath work, body focus meditation, consistent and slow exposure to safe emotional activation. And here we're no longer in the realm of talking and thinking, but we're working with the senses and tuning into the body itself, moment to moment. What improves over months of this work is interoceptive accuracy, the brain's ability to correctly read and interpret its own internal signals. For example, emotions stop feeling like threats we need to escape and become information we can use to better adjust to the specific circumstance. Think about what that unlocks for you. You can feel anger without dreading you're about to lose control. You can feel attraction without bracing for catastrophe. You can feel vulnerability and stay present in the moment during conflict or intimacy without pulling back or dissociating the moment things start heating up. In other words, the full spectrum of feelings becomes available to you, rather than being something you have to suppress or manage from a safe distance. For many of us, that alone is a revelation, because the body stops being the enemy. Now let's go another step deeper to the autonomic nervous system itself. Here we're regulating vagal tone, stress recovery speed, and expanding the window of tolerance. All these can be trained, but the metaphor that's suitable here is that we're repairing the electrical system while we need to keep the lights in the building on. As I mentioned last time, these patterns were set during infancy, and any meaningful, noticeable autonomic shift is going to take prolonged work with tools like polyvagal informed therapies, slowing down the breath and extending the exhales, safe emotional co-regulation, cardio exercise, and trauma processing that is careful to avoid re-traumatization. Where work on the insula over several months might mean that emotions begin to feel more manageable, autonomic recalibration is a different order of change. It's the difference between occasionally catching yourself before you get emotionally flooded and having a fundamentally different baseline to return to. For example, you can have difficult conversations without your heart pounding out of your chest or shutting down. And you can return to baseline in a matter of hours instead of days. At this point in the video, you're probably intuitively getting why, without this deeper layer of work, you can have a really solid understanding of your patterns and still find yourself with very narrow room to regulate your emotional state. And now we're discovering that rewiring a building while living in it takes quite a long time. And it takes showing up in your body repeatedly with the consistency you can't shortcut. The good news is that most of these tools don't require therapy, coaching, or a large financial investment. But the challenge is of a totally different kind. We actually need to build new habits and sustain them over a long enough arc for the structural changes to take hold. That's a different kind of hard than most of us are used to. It's not the intellectually demanding kind, but it requires the kind of steadiness that our nervous systems, almost by definition, have been missing. This is where we've been heading all along. The structures we're about to look at are the least pliable, yet the most important to understand. At this depth, we're no longer talking about skills. We're talking about threat detection systems and stress calibration mechanisms that were shaped largely before you had any conscious autobiographical memory. Here we're going to look at three distinct systems. We'll start with the amygdala's threat templates, those implicit pre-verbal memories I described last time. As a quick refresher, the amygdala can initiate a threat response within roughly 10 to 20 milliseconds. That's about 20 times faster than you can consciously register and evaluate the signal. By the time you've formed your first thought about it, the cascade is already well underway. Changing these templates takes something cognitive work alone can't give you. It takes new associative learning at the emotional level. When a threat the brain expects doesn't materialize, the circuit generates a prediction error signal. And that signal is what drives the learning. The model gets updated gradually through many such action prediction loops. But the tricky part here is that we're working with emotional material, with emotional imprints. So if your nervous system expects rejection in a certain context, but instead you experience safety, that discrepancy becomes the signal, the raw material for revision. And the larger the discrepancy from the original expectation and the more repeatedly you run into it, the stronger the update. Some tools that reliably work at this level include EMDR and other trauma reprocessing therapies that deliberately couple activation of your system, emotional activation, with corrective experience. Yet there's another understated but arguably more powerful mechanism: long-term relational safety and consistency. We're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of moments where the prediction doesn't match the outcome. For example, being vulnerable doesn't lead to the rejection you expect, or disappointing your partner doesn't end in being abandoned, or being fully seen doesn't end in being shamed or humiliated. This is a slow and painstaking process, and the timeline for deep repatterning is measured in years. On a similar time horizon sits the HPA axis. It's a chemical regulatory loop that controls cortisol release and our sensitivity to stress. Its calibration is heavily driven by the quality of caregiving we get during infancy and early exposure to chronic stress. If you remember, this process involves epigenetic modifications, and they're stable by design. But all this is kind of abstract. Let's try to develop an intuition for what chronic HPA activation actually feels like from the inside. It's like a low-grade but persistent sense of impending disaster. The body remains biochemically active and prepared for threat, even when the environment is neutral. I've heard people describe it as some variation on the following theme. Living in that state is like being stuck on a raft in the middle of a stormy ocean, hanging onto the sides, just trying not to get thrown off. There's no rest in that, there's no looking around to explore, and there's certainly no thriving. But the body's doing exactly what it was calibrated to do, staying alert and ready to ensure your survival. The problem is it never got the signal that the storm had passed years ago. How do we make positive shifts here? Through something that's often easier said than done: maintaining a healthy lifestyle. We're talking about the usual suspects: consistent physical activity, nutrient-dense nutrition, adequate sleep, rich positive social interactions, reducing your chronic stress load. Over time, this environmental enrichment recalibrates baseline stress reactivity, smooths out those cortisol spikes, and improves the overall efficiency of stress recovery. And if you're paying close attention, you may have noticed something curious we just uncovered. Something that many coaches and gurus online will never tell you. That thriving isn't just a matter of mindset. It's the biological result of your HPA axis finally finding its way back to safety, to its natural balanced state of homeostasis. It's something that takes lifestyle adjustment over years, and unfortunately is quite difficult in our always-on culture. And with that, we arrive at the deepest layer. What it stores, according to John Bowlby's original attachment theory, is our internal working models. Think of these as your brain's operating system, a set of foundational procedural rules about how the world and all relationships work. These aren't explicit beliefs you can change by reflection. These are embodied predictions about closeness, safety, and responsiveness. They answer questions like, what will happen when you reach towards someone you're emotionally close to? Do you expect they'll respond or ignore you? Does being vulnerable with others feel like the path to connection or self-destruction? Does depending on someone land in your body as deepening closeness or loss of autonomy? Take a second to internalize this. Because if you've ever wondered why reflection or willpower don't seem to touch certain things, this is why. These models aren't stored where thinking happens. They're distributed across limbic and cortical networks, and they're so durable because they were embedded and trained through many thousands of repeated interactions within formative attachment relationships. To use a software metaphor, we don't modify the operating system by deleting the original source code. We need to write new lines of code on top of it. In other words, we need to build additional neural pathways in parallel. That shift happens through emotionally corrective experiences and therapeutic approaches that put the relationship itself front and center. Attachment-based psychotherapy, emotionally focused therapy, internal family systems. These are all modalities that are built on the understanding that our psychological distress is often rooted in or maintained by early relational patterns, and that to unwind those, we need to activate and work with the same nonverbal systems. Give this enough repetitions and the alternative pathway strengthens. We've successfully diverted traffic. The old road is still in place, but it's rarely in active use. This is the hardest work, first to recognize and then to embark on. Why? Well, because A, it depends massively on interactions with other human beings, And more subtly, B, it depends on recognizing that repairs are needed to begin with. And that's tricky because these deep structures have a real stabilizing function. Since they were installed in conditions where their function was to ensure survival, the entire system has a vested interest in keeping them unchanged. And this shows up as defense mechanisms, which in turn create blind spots in the very places where you need revision the most. We often tend to get frustrated and think of it as some kind of a personal failure. You know, we didn't have enough willpower, not enough discipline, didn't figure out how to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. But as we're seeing in this section, often we need different tools. We may need new experiences repeated over and over in safe enough conditions for those new neural pathways to start forming and for us to see that gradual transformation. So what does having a clearer picture of all this actually change? For one thing, it changes how we relate to ourselves. We can start replacing harsh self-criticism with a greater patience and compassion for ourselves. It also changes the kind of interventions we look for and how we pace them. We can replace one-size-fits-all approaches with greater discernment. And it changes what we expect from the healing process to begin with. We can replace wishful thinking with greater realism. If any of what we covered today landed with you, please share it with someone who might need the message. And I'd truly love to hear what resonated with you and how all this fits with your own experience. Thanks for being here. Take good care of yourselves and see you next time.